Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization, as well as something that brings you joy. Be sure to select panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to post any questions that you may have during the conversation in the Q&A box. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed on Friday to all who registered, as well as additional follow-up resources that you see shared in the chat. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Finally, before we begin, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on February 1st, we have Big Bets Part 3, Community Schools Accelerating Equitable Recovery at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. The following week, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting off with a Crucible Practice Salon at 12:30 Eastern Time, followed by an emerging model session on accelerating literacy through same language subtitling. Information and registration for these upcoming opportunities will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Becky Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Families on Shaky Ground, Uncloaking and Addressing the Realities of Persistent Instability. As we all know, the pandemic has wreaked havoc on the stability across the economic spectrum of families. But the burden of this instability has fallen most heavily on families with the fewest resources. Those who may have been experiencing significant trauma prior to the pandemic have now been impacted more deeply for many reasons, such as lack of internet connectivity for education, loss of income due to lack of employment, or employment as essential workers and the stress that has accompanied those positions, unstable housing, food insecurity, and the list goes on and on. The pandemic has affected our children and their families and the people that work in the systems that serve them, especially and in particular, the early care system. I just returned from a 2-week trip to Colorado where I went to take care of my 3-year-old granddaughter. Her childcare center and the preschool, that's part of it, was closed down due to a COVID outbreak among staff and children. Our family had the resources to make that happen, but not every family is able to do so. Our panel today represents a very special set of individuals who are researching and advising that research of this impact on the pandemic, and who are bringing forward the voices of those most impacted, as well as implementing models to address that. We are going to hear about this extraordinary research and also plan to explore together with all of you ways to move forward to mitigate the impact of this trauma on families and to strengthen the systems that serve them. If you have not introduced yourself yet in the chat, please do so and let us know something that is bringing you joy these days. For me, it was those most recent precious days with my granddaughter, James, and the many, many, many books we read together. And when she would lean her head on my shoulder and say, "I love you." And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Elena Rivera. Elena joined the Children's Institute in 2015. As a senior health policy and program advisor, she is responsible for establishing strong linkages between health and early learning in policy and advocacy efforts, including identifying opportunities to leverage Oregon's health system transformation to improve outcomes for young children. Elena also works to integrate health and family support services at Children's Institute's early works demonstration sites. Elena, I'll turn it over to you to get us started on today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Becky, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm joining from Portland, Oregon, where we're enjoying some beautiful winter sunshine this week, which is bringing me a lot of joy. It's been fun to see fellow Oregonians in the chat, and I'm looking forward to connecting with everyone today. I just want to take a moment to welcome everyone into this space, however you're able to show up. If you're able to really deeply engage, share comments in the chat, ask questions of our incredible panelists, take notes, that's fabulous. If you're tuning in feeling a little distracted, overwhelmed, maybe you are multitasking today, we welcome you too. And I hope you're able to find one little piece of gold to walk away with, whether it's one data point from the rapid survey findings that really resonates with you, or a story from a community that gives you hope. Let's let this next hour and a half be a bit of a treasure hunt for some fuel to carry us forward. I work at Children's Institute, which is an organization that advocates for programs, policies, and funding to help all children in Oregon thrive. And the best part of my job is that I get to hear from families and communities about what matters most to them, and then partner together to develop solutions. And what I've been hearing since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic are two kinds of stories. So first, a story of families on shaky ground, the title of this webinar, with parents facing really devastating hardship and stress, children losing connection to healthcare services, learning opportunities, and social connection. But I'm also hearing stories of resilience. So families are taking time to log online to virtual play and learn groups to connect with other families and give their children that opportunity to develop with them. Community members volunteering to keep a food pantry running. Parents helping to design a social emotional learning curriculum for their children in partnership with an elementary school. These are some of the stories that are giving me hope and reminding me that families are strong, families are resourceful, and they deeply care about their communities. Families are not fragile. It's the systems that are meant to support them, which are. And that's exactly why we've come together today. We're going to listen from this incredible panel, learn from them, and then really start exchanging ideas and strategizing about building better systems, shifting policy, and ensuring that funding and support for families is urgently prioritized. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, and after each introduction, I'll invite these panelists to share something that's bringing them joy today. So our first panelist is Dr. Phil Fisher. Dr. Fisher is a Philip H. Knight Chair and Professor of Psychology at the University of Oregon, where he serves as founding director of the Center for Translational Neuroscience, and is also a senior fellow at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. He's particularly interested in the effects of early stressful experiences on children, and currently the lead investigator on the ongoing Rapid EC project, a national survey on the well-being of households with young children during the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Fisher, and please share something that's bringing you joy today.
Hi, Elena, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm just gonna duplicate what Sarah said, or I'm sorry, what Becky said, which is that I'm in San Francisco right now because even though I live in Oregon, my one-year-old granddaughter has her first birthday this Sunday. So we're in town to help her celebrate and to help her parents prepare for her first birthday party.
That is beautiful and so fun. I hope it's a fun birthday party. Thank you so much.
Elena, I'm going to jump in. We are still hearing that very high-pitched sound, and we are thinking it might be coming from your ear microphone.
Oh, shoot.
Is there a way to take those out and let us test it without?
This is any better. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, and right now we don't hear the sound. So let's test it with that.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that, everyone. Hopefully this is working better.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, our next panelist is Dr. Joan Lombardi. Dr. Lombardi is a senior scholar at the Center for Child and Human Development at Georgetown University and a senior fellow with the Georgetown Collaborative on Global Children's Issues. Over the past 50 years, Joan has made significant contributions in the areas of child and family policy as an innovative leader and policy advisor. She advises philanthropy and public agencies, served as the first Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood during the Obama administration, and the first Director of the Childcare Bureau during the Clinton administration. And Joan chairs the National Advisory for the Rapid EC Project. Dr. Lombardi, welcome. And would you share something that's bringing you joy today?
Well, thank you so much, Elena. And I'll keep the theme going. What brings me joy is the faces of children, babies that I see walking down the street. I can't hug them the way I want to anymore right now, but all of children's faces, including, of course, my own, bring me great joy.
Wonderful. All right, our third panelist is Portia Kennel. Portia is a veteran leader in the early childhood field. Before joining the Buffett Early Childhood Fund in 2015, she worked as the Senior Vice President for Program Innovation at Start Early in Chicago. In her current role, Portia leads efforts to develop family engagement program models that empower parents as a force for change in their families, schools, and communities. With more than 25 years of experience designing, implementing, and scaling effective and research-based early childhood education and family support programs, Portia is truly a leader in this field. As the founding executive director of the Educare Learning Network, Portia also led the national expansion of Educare to a diverse range of communities across America. Portia, welcome. What is bringing you joy today? You may be on mute, Portia.
I'm on mute. Okay, there we go.
We can hear you now.
Now, hello. Oh, wait a second. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to make sure. Hello, everyone. Hi to all of you out there in virtual Zoom land. What's giving me joy this week is I had a meeting with the project leaders. The other thing I like to work on is professional development for staff in early childhood who have the responsibility of working directly with families. And I am so grateful for the staff that are participating in this pilot. As soon as we started it, the pandemic came. And we had a meeting, and I really expected 2 years ago that they would say, you know what, we can't do this. We've got too much. No. But instead, they have hung in there for over 2 years. The staff have hung in there. So that gives me joy about the resilience of staff also.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, resilience is already a theme for the day. I love that. All right, well, we are going to dive right into the panel, and we'll get started with hearing from Dr. Fisher to ground us in the Rapid EC project and his learnings about the challenges of persistent instability and financial hardship that families are facing. So without further ado, thank you, Phil.
Great. Thanks, Elena. So I am not in control of the slides, so I'll be also asking for the slides to be advanced as I'm going through the information that I'm about to present. So let's go on to the next slide. Great. So the rapid EC surveys began at the outset of the pandemic back in April of 2020 and has been underway ever since then. So the initial primary focus of the rapid surveys was on households with at least one child, age 5 and under. And the reason that we got the survey going was really that when the pandemic began, our team, which has done lots of work on early childhood development and how experiences shape both brain and health and cognitive and social emotional development across the lifespan, really felt that there was a sort of a big gap in the existing knowledge base about what young children and the adults in their lives were going to be going through. Initially, we thought that the survey would be relatively short-lived, but that our team could really contribute in ways that we might not otherwise be able to, because our day-to-day operations at our center had really been shut down, like so many other people. Since then, obviously, the pandemic has continued. And more importantly, I think as we've shifted our focus, we've come to see that we're living in times that are really sort of a new normal in terms of a number of different factors, not just the pandemic, but issues related to climate, issues related to our kind of political divisions in this country. And as a result, we really have come to see the surveys as a really critical tool for bearing witness to and understanding the voices of households with young kids in this country and other adults in their lives. The way the survey works is that it goes out and can be completed in 15 minutes. And at present, it's available in English and Spanish, although we have plans to expand it into other languages. People can complete it via computer or smartphone. You just need some form of internet connectivity. The household survey at this point has been completed by more than 12,000 caregivers across the country. And our sample is national in terms of the geographic distribution, in terms of income, as well as race and ethnicity. We really focus the core of the survey on 5 specific areas. And in a lot of ways, these are the areas that if you're interested in supporting the well-being of young children, are most critical. So parent well-being and child well-being are the first 2 of those areas. We also look at the economic circumstances and ability to pay for basic needs that families typically encounter, as well as childcare and healthcare. To date, we've actually fielded over 90 surveys, so our numbers continue to increase as we go across time. One additional note, we pay participants for their completion of any survey. Next slide, please. There are a lot of surveys out there that have been conducted not only during the pandemic, but since then. And I just want to say that a number of things sort of distinguish our survey from others. One is the frequency with which it's done. When the survey began, we knew that circumstances were volatile and dynamic enough that if we were going to tell the story of what households were going through, that we needed to collect data on a regular basis and turn it around on a regular basis. And that's what we've done. So the survey was weekly initially, went out to over 1,000 families. Then it became every other week or twice a month. And now in 2022, we're moving forward with monthly surveys. We're able to get the data in and turned around and analyzed in a matter of days. And so we can really report back in almost real time about what people are going through. The survey is structured in such a way that we have both qualitative and quantitative data. So we ask numerically oriented questions, but we also ask open-ended questions. The open-ended questions, it's clear that households are really eager to share what's going on with us. We've had over 150,000 responses to the open-ended questions, and people are really telling us what's happening, what's happening on the positive side, what the challenges are. We can ask people what they'd like their elected officials to know, and so forth. I want to be clear, this is not a standard sort of epidemiologic survey. We knew that if we were doing sort of the gold standard of epidemiology, that it would be very slow moving and we wouldn't be able to turn things around quite as quickly. But nevertheless, we really do embrace as much scientific rigor as is possible. And we have a number of experts in survey research methodology who are kind of behind the study. And then as you'll see, and let's move on to the next slide. The other thing is that our team is really made up of multi-sector perspectives so that it's not specifically a research project, but rather a project that's designed to elicit and really then amplify community voices in the context of early childhood development. We have a number of funders that are listed here that have supported the work and to whom we're extremely grateful to date, and we continue to rely on philanthropic funding to make the survey happen. Next slide, please. The work, as I said, is really informed by this amazing set of advisories. We have a national advisory for the household survey that, as you can see, includes researchers, but also policy and funder folks, as well as providers themselves and others. Let's move on. We also have, for the second survey that we launched, which is a household, or rather a provider survey of the early childhood workforce that runs in parallel to the household survey, a second advisory, again, with that multi-sector perspective from a variety of different areas of early childhood that are providing input into the design and the dissemination of results. Next slide. And then we also have convened, and you'll be hearing more from Joan Lombardi about this, a team of policy experts to really help us understand not only what's coming up in the policy landscape that's most critical, but again, how to get the information, the voices and the kind of bearing witness that we're doing out and into the hands of those who can make use of it to really support young children and the adults in their lives, not only at the national level, but also at state and community levels. Next slide. I want to emphasize that in order to pull off a survey as ambitious as this, with households providing 1,000 participants every time it goes out and the same number of providers, that we have developed really strong partnerships in order not only to recruit, but also to disseminate information. You can see here a number of these partnerships that are really critical. One that I want to highlight in particular is the Riser Network. Our work, it's extremely important to us that we're focusing on issues of structural racism and inequality, and that we're not only seeing the challenges and the strengths of families sort of just from a straightforward perspective, but that we're centering on issues of structural racial inequality as we understand. And the Riser Network is a group of Black child development researchers that have been extremely important partners, again, in crafting content and in understanding how to disseminate it. I'll also note that Homegrown is an organization that we've worked with specifically on the provider survey to make sure that we're connected specifically to family, friends, and neighbor providers, really a sort of a not well understood and often neglected sector of the childcare workforce. Okay, next slide, please. Let's just go past this one. Again, lots of emerging partnerships underway. Since the survey began, we have a pretty robust response rate, 68%. You can see that there have been a lot of ways that we've been getting the word out, not only through our own reports, but also through media coverage. And then we've done a number of briefings, both at the national and local levels, to provide people with information about what we're finding, which I'm about to tell you. So let's move on. Okay, so what is it that we have been finding over the course of the survey? Next slide. First, I'm going to be talking about what we've been finding in the household survey that's been ongoing since April of 2020. Next slide, please. So the story of households with young children during the pandemic and how children are doing is really closely tied, not surprisingly, I'm sure to anybody on this call, to how the adults in children's lives are doing. And in particular, there's an area of our survey that's continued to really stand out as what's driving child and family well-being. And that is the extent to which families are struggling with the ability to pay for basic needs. So you can see across the span of the survey, and this goes through this past fall, what you can see is that the proportion of families that report that they're experiencing difficulty with at least one area of basic needs, whether it's food or housing or utilities or other basic needs, has really been at the levels of extreme concern. When the pandemic began, we saw a dramatic increase so that more than 1 in 3 families across time was experiencing that kind of hardship. Since January of 2021, we saw those numbers go down. But I just want to note that even though the graph looks pretty good, that still at least 1 in 4 families in the US with children aged 5 and under is having difficulty making ends meet. So really dramatic numbers of concern. Next slide, please. And the other thing that I think is critical in our findings that have, again, not surprising, but really validated by our data, is that the more areas and the more difficulty people are having making ends meet, the more distress that they're reporting on their own part. And so you can see that by the yellow bars going up as you get more and more hardships, and also by the gray bars that children are experiencing more and more difficulties on a day-to-day basis, to the extent that they're also living in circumstances where there's more hardship. So a direct link between ability to pay for basic needs, parents' well-being, and then child well-being. Next slide, please. This is illustrated not just in the overall hardship, but you can see it in terms of this very stark proportion of families that's experiencing hunger. Again, if you think about this at its height, close to 1 in 3, but even as we've moved in further forward into the pandemic, we're still seeing 1 in 5 families with young children not able to pay, not having enough money to buy food on a monthly basis, leading to hunger in the family. Next slide, please. And as we saw with overall hardship, you can see this, again, direct link between ability to obtain food and distress, where using the US Department of Agriculture questions, the more hunger, the more difficulties obtaining food, the higher levels of distress for both adults and children. And I want to say that in our data, this is not just these two things are related between parents and children's distress, but what we see is that in a given week, if a parent reports that they're stressed because they can't meet for basic needs, then when we look down the road a bit, we subsequently ask them about their children, they report that subsequently their children are distressed. So it's really kind of like a chain reaction of hardship from parents to children. Next slide. Again, we can see if we just look at emotional distress across the period of the pandemic, that we can track how things have been changing. And I think this is really sort of good evidence for the value of collecting data on a regular basis. So the numbers here are based on a emotional distress scale that goes from 1 to 100, where 100 is the highest and 0 is the lowest. And what you can see, people, when we ask them to report back on their distress levels before the pandemic, the numbers were relatively low, just around 25. But they really shot up and almost doubled as soon as we started asking them about what their distress levels have been like during the pandemic. One thing I really want to point out is that distress levels track with the way that the pandemic is ebbing and flowing. So you can see it going up during the initial surge. If you remember back to last spring, when it looked like things were going to get better, distress levels started to go down. But then over the summer, as we started to see the surge in the Delta variant, the numbers have gone back up again. So those numbers are really kind of ebbing and flowing directly in relation to what we're seeing with the pandemic and all of the circumstances that the pandemic has brought with it. And I think this really shows, if you want to see how families are doing, it's extremely helpful to track them across time. Next slide. We mentioned that the survey includes open-ended questions. And so we can ask people what kinds of things are creating the most distress, what's most difficult for you right now. And again, I just want to point out that when we do that, when we ask that and we analyze kind of the thematic content of the many thousands of responses that we get, that you can see that the things that are in that prior slide around the rise of the Delta variant last summer, causing increases in distress are all related to the pandemic. So the three big topics that came up that were increasing in their frequency of people mentioning them were concerns about getting COVID, concerns specifically about the Delta variant and public health measures that were being taken, and worries about losing childcare. Those all increased dramatically during last summer as distress levels were increasing. Okay, let's go to the next slide. The other thing that's really important in our data to understand is how much, in addition to the basic areas of material hardship that are creating distress, that the other thing that's really part of the new normal is the degree to which lives have become less predictable and kind of less stable across time, because people don't really know what's coming. And what we've seen is that the more unpredictability that exists, it adds an additional dimension of distress to both parents and children. So let's look at this in the next slide. So what you can see here is that as the amount of unpredictability is increasing, we see a direct relationship to families' abilities to follow daily regular routines. So that's sort of like the underlying way in which the pandemic and the unpredictability in terms of basic needs is really impacting families. It makes it harder for day-to-day life to continue in a kind of a stable way. And the flip side is true as well, by the way. Silver lining wise, even if families are struggling, to the extent that they've been able to maintain regular routines, they seem to be doing better and be more able in terms of their own and their children's distress to withstand that unpredictability. Next slide, please. The issue around unpredictability, and you can just hit another return here, is really critical in terms of what we know, and this is true of our own team's research as well as many decades of other research, because predictability is really critical in the developing architecture of children's brains. To the extent that children have consistent and nurturing care, you can see healthy circuitry forming among various areas of the brain that are critical and form kind of the basis of necessary life skills, like the ability to focus your attention, the ability to solve problems, the ability to show control when you need to instead of just kind of being impulsive. All of those things require consistent and responsive early care. And so when we think about the extent to which levels of unpredictability have really increased across the population and are especially high in subgroups that have historically been exposed to structural inequalities based on race and income, we're concerned that this new normal has the potential to affect children's health and development, and that the extent to which supportive buffers can be in place in the way of caregiving can really make a difference to offsetting those effects. Next slide, please. I think it's important to recognize that the burden of offsetting the effects of unpredictability shouldn't just reside in families and in providers, but also in the government. And in fact, given that instability in the ability to pay for basic needs is one of the strongest drivers of how well families are doing, the child tax credit actually had a huge potential to create more stability in that area than was existing previously in the pandemic. And so one of the things that we'll be really interested in as our data continues to come in post the end of the child tax credit is whether there's evidence of, and we've certainly found evidence that the child tax credit was helping to create more stability. So we want to see now what's going to happen now that we go back to the period after the child tax credit was happening. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to touch briefly before I pass the baton to Joan on the findings from our childcare provider survey, which again has been happening only since last April, but still we've begun to accrue a considerable amount of data about what providers are going through. So next slide, please. One of the things that's really critical that you see across the board and that has been reported extensively in the media is the extent to which there have been significant disruptions in the availability of childcare. So lots of parents in our survey, this is back to the household survey, have reported that they experienced considerable amount of childcare disruptions, a lot of which are due to staffing shortages. And we've seen lots of evidence that staffing is really being affected by the fact that there are other jobs that are available that have historically been equivalent with childcare in terms of wages and benefits, but now have really changed. And so the childcare workforce is sort of being in many ways impacted and drawn away from the work that has historically been done. And when parents report less availability of childcare, that it's been disrupted, you can see that they also report in these bottom graphs increased levels of distress for both themselves and their children. The dark blue bars show distress levels for people who have had childcare disruptions. The light blue bars show when they haven't, so higher levels when there have been disruptions. Next slide. You can see that not only is it parents that have been reporting more stress, but you can see that providers themselves are reporting equivalent levels of disruptions, and that when those disruptions occurred, the effects are pretty devastating. So large portions are reporting being stressed, being exhausted, being anxious, having it be hard to engage in work, and feeling depressed in the context of not having enough staff to provide for the children in their care. Next slide. And I think this is especially true when it comes to the issues of recruiting and retaining staff, that the challenges around recruiting and retaining staff are particularly impacting people's well-being. And if you look at this slide, it really tells you sort of the reasons why it's been difficult, according to providers, to recruit and retain staff. The biggest reason is the low wages. If you could look at the green bar, you can see that. The next, just in terms of retaining staff, has to do with burnout. And you can see that a large portion of people report retention is affected by burnout. And then other issues that are very relevant, like the lack of benefits and concerns about health and safety, are further affecting the ability to sustain and have the workforce really meet the needs that exist for care. Next slide. So, I mean, one of our questions is whether, as these issues continue, where there's not enough care around, where providers themselves are saying that they don't really have adequate working conditions and wages are too low, but parents can't really bear the burden of increased childcare costs because they're already maxed out, and there's a lack of availability, whether we're going to begin to see the whole system increasingly implode, which will create a tremendous crisis, not only for families and for the workforce, but also for the economic sector. And we've already started to see that with the labor shortages that exist across many sectors of the economy. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to let people kind of their eyes glance over this as you hear me talk. But basically, these are all comments around the sources of stress from not having childcare or from being a childcare provider that come from our open-ended questions. And as you can see, people are very vocal and very clear about what's going on and how this is having a tremendously negative impact. Okay, next slide. So I will finish here and pass the baton to Joan. Again, my acknowledgements here are not only to our advisories, but to the amazing research team behind this, and to all the families and providers that have really shared their voices with us and allowed us to get the word out to them. Thank you very much. And now to you, Joan.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Hi, Phil. Actually, could I jump in real quick, because there are a couple great quick questions in the Q&A that have been emerging for you, Phil, that I just want to surface. So folks are asking about the survey participants and where that sample comes from, and if it's the same participants each week or if participants are varied. Would you share a little bit about that?
Great questions. I'm happy to answer additional questions in the chat, by the way, as we move forward. And we'll also have time in the Q&A. But I think just so you're not holding that question in your minds as we move forward, we, again, have sort of attempted to be as pragmatic as possible in making sure that we get the information that we need. So of the 1,000 households, we have used a hybrid strategy where we have a large pool of participants that have agreed to answer the survey questions. And in order to make sure that we're getting good representation, both in terms of race and ethnicity and income and geography, each time the survey goes out, we invite a subset of those individuals to complete the survey. As a result, we have a large number of individuals that have taken the survey more than one time, and many of them have taken it on a repeated basis. And then we have some that have only taken it one time. And we're able to use multivariate statistical modeling to be able to draw longitudinal conclusions, because there's enough overlap in people who've taken the survey repeatedly over time that we can make inferential statistical kind of conclusions about the data from this hybrid approach. And again, we vetted this past epidemiologists and statisticians as a viable way to move forward that's practical, but doesn't require typically overburdened and stressed individuals to have to, sign on to always participating every time a survey comes out.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And there are a couple other questions in the Q&A box that you can respond to when you have a moment. Now I'm happy to invite Joan Lombardi to share her comments. Dr. Lombardi, in addition to chairing the National Advisory for the Rapid EC Project, you're also involved in a really wide range of national and international child and family policy efforts. And so we are excited to hear your comments on the policy implications of what Dr. Fisher has just shared.
Well, thanks so much, Becky. And actually, I'm really interested in the things that are coming in from the chat, because what is exciting every time Phil and I present about the survey is the people's reaction and their validation for some of the things that we're seeing on the national level, that people are seeing in individual programs and communities across the country. I must say that I want to pick up on your question about joy to start my remarks, because I was trying to do a survey of the answers in the chat to see how people were responding. And it did make me think that we should add the question of what brings you joy to the survey next week, so we can get, but what came out clearly is children, dogs, and TV series. And so I don't know what that means, but I found it really interesting. On a more serious note, I think that what the survey has really done, as you heard from Phil, soon we'll be at almost 2 years, and it's certainly a sad commentary on the pandemic, but the survey is really going to go on past the pandemic. What we have now, what we'll have, is really an archive of what was life like for these families across the United States over the last 2 years. And we're really proud of that. We're really excited that people across the country are using the data. As Phil mentioned, and one more thing about the advisory before my own remarks, partnerships are in our DNA. So the way we've approached this survey is to continually hear from other people in the field, get their input, and bring them into the Rapid family, as you will, so that we can be learning from them as we go along. I just want to pick up on the word unpredictability, and I think we all feel it, don't we? We plan for Christmas and then we have to cancel it. We plan trips and then we have to cancel them. And I think each of us has felt that stress. On the policy side, it's been the same thing. Policies have not been predictable. We started out with the stabilization, but it was seen as a temporary fix. And that's what's been so difficult from a policy perspective in implementing some of the provisions, because we know they're not going to be long-standing, and parents know that. So, usually in a crisis, you have an acute time and then you have a recovery period. But what we've had is an acute period and then recovery and then another acute period. And I think that protracted nature of the conflict, of the crisis, has been the reason for all of our stress about unpredictability that we've seen throughout. So But I'm with you, Becky. I'm hopeful because of the people that are on the line today and all the things that we're seeing across the country that people are doing for and with parents. I want to just briefly, before I pass it to Portia, who's been so central to this advisory effort, I want to talk about 4 implications. First and foremost, one of the most important implications of the work and of the other studies that have been done, and it sounds so common sense, it is common sense, research findings are often common sense, is that caregiver well-being matters to child development. And I'll say that again, caregiver well-being matters to child development, whether we're talking about families or whether we're talking about other caregivers, such as childcare providers. So the conditions that families face affect child well-being, income, social networks, mental health supports. Those matter along with the direct supports that we provide for children in programs. Unfortunately, for too long, both in our thinking and in our research and certainly in our policies, those two have been separate. So we have policies for children and we think of policies for adults, but we don't see them as affecting each other. And too often people say, well, you have to make a choice. Do you want child tax credits or you want childcare? What our study is saying is we need both because both of them affect the well-being of children and the strength of families. I really want to credit the Aspen Institute, who has been doing amazing work about documenting and framing the importance of a 2-generation approach to policy. And that's, I think, what we're talking about here. It's what was in the DNA of Head Start. It's really that multi-generational approach. It's much harder to do if you're a single program focusing on one or another. So our policies have to start moving forward in a way that brings pieces of the community together so that we can not all do the same thing, but at least row in the same direction. And I would say that that shouldn't stop at 5. So more and more schools, I think, have to begin to think about how do they partner with the local social service agency and the mental health agency as children move into kindergarten and the primary grades. Many people know I've been in the field for early childhood for a long time. We've had a lot more focus on preschool, less focus on infants and toddlers, and certainly less focus on the importance of children going into quality schools. And that's one of the reasons I've always been excited about the grade level reading campaign, because you get that breadth. But our policies have to start coming together, and we have to do that at the community level. The second part of the caregiver is the other adults in children's lives. Phil and I often talk about surround sound for children. It's the families and the other caregivers that may be spending 8-10 hours a day with children. So of course, their well-being matters, but our policies have not reflected that. And I think they will come to roost when it comes to childcare during the pandemic. Because what we are seeing with the breakdown of even further of the working conditions of childcare providers really has been the historic trajectory of the field. It's just much worse now when you can go to a big box store, as someone mentioned, and make a higher wage than you can make in childcare. But it's not just the wage, it's the working conditions. It's the lack of stability and predictability. I can't remember in this presentation if Phil mentioned, but we hear stories from providers that they don't know what's next on in front of them for work from childcare providers a few weeks ahead of time. And so the unpredictability of the childcare workforce is a major concern to children, not just to their providers, because these two things are related. We absolutely cannot build the childcare system back better, or whatever you want to call it, if we ignore the income and the well-being of the childcare workforce. And that's got to be a big priority in our policies going forward. So that's the first implication of this is that simple concept. Secondly, it's been very interesting for all of us that work in childcare or in schools to see the lack of connection between those. So we have stories you've all heard, as I have, schools close down, but childcare continues. School teachers sometimes were prioritized for vaccines, but the childcare providers were not. But they were the ones that were caring for the children when the schools closed. So what this says to me from a policy perspective is we have to be putting much more, we have to put more connections between what's going on in school and what's going on in the early childhood programs, or the other way, if you want to say it, in the life course way. And, you know, I can't emphasize this enough. We've had a lot of debates in the field about the importance of a mixed delivery system. I couldn't agree more in the early childhood space, but that doesn't mean you ignore schools. They are often the largest child serving agency in a community. And we have to have many more linkages between schools and childcare as we go forward. Both of these points say to me, we've got to have community-wide planning that focuses on a vision, bringing people together, rowing in the same direction towards a better child outcome, and putting a much stronger focus on equity. And I see that in communities from Palm Beach to, and I know they're on the line, from Tulsa to Bridgeport. So there's a lot of exciting things going on. Let me do my last 2 points very quickly and then turn to Portia. One of the most important things I think right now are connections, and we have to reconnect personally. And you know, someone said this is going to be the age of reconnection. The bright spot in the pandemic is that technology has helped us stay connected. It's allowed us to stay connected to families, but it does have its limitations, doesn't it? We'd all much rather be in a room together. And certainly for young children, it's not the answer to teaching them. We have to put much more focus on their social emotional connections. We do, however, have to think with people that are on the forefront of technology about, I would say we should do a hackathon on this and ask all of the great tech gurus to tell us how can they design technology in a way that brings us together rather than in a way that separates us, which has been the traditional thing that's happened when, you know, children are on their iPhones or on their in front of screens and stay disconnected. And then my final point of implications of the study is really about the methodology. To me, it's not just the outcomes and the findings that Phil presented. It's the process of listening to families. And, you know, this should not be temporary. And it should not just be done at the national level. It really has to be done at the program and community level. We provide not only a mechanism to listen to families, but we've been trying more and more to feed back that information to families. We're going to put together, we have some advisory committees, we're going to increase those to try to have a feedback loop. This is all about that feedback loop. We can't assume we know what parents need. We have to ask them, we have to listen to them, and we have to respond to them, and our policymakers should do the same thing. So I'll leave it there and turn it to Portia, or turn it back to Becky.
Thank you so much, Joan. I so appreciate those policy implications. And it sounds like a challenge to all of us to be thinking today and moving forward on how policy can really be focused on the goal of creating stability and creating predictability. So it really is that long-term vision, the end game of having a strong system of support and a safety net that really upholds and uplifts families. And on that note of really centering the voices and the experiences of families, we are so excited to now hear some notes from Portia Kennel on just the families and the providers who she works with, from their perspective, what are they experiencing? What are they needing? What is helping them get through this time? Portia?
Thank you so much. It's Phil and Joan, it's been an honor to work with you on this, really a highlight over this past couple of years. So let me tell you guys quickly what I'd like to share with you today. First of all, I'd like to share the impact and possibility of the rapid study from the perspective of practitioners, whether you're talking about caregivers, daycare, there are other practitioners, home visitors, all the, as I say, boots on the ground at the front lines. So I'm going to just share some reflections about that and how the study has informed their work. And secondly, I'm going to end with, as they say in Reggio Emilia, a provocation for us to think about together. First of all, I just want to say this. This is unique. The pandemic has impacted all of us. It isn't just that it impacted caregivers, families, and practitioners in the field or policy people. We are all going through the pandemic together. This is not something that we are hearing people say and the caregivers say. We are experiencing it together. And I think we need to think about that. No matter what role you're in the early childhood system, we're all experiencing this pandemic together. Families, practitioners, childcare providers, caregivers, policy advocates, and communities, we're all in this together. So keep that thought in your mind as I speak. The next thing I want to do is really share with you some reflections about the impact of the study. I would say reflections and the promise of the study that Phil and the team are leading. And I want you to hold in your mind two quotes as I talk today. Next slide, please. I want you to hold this in mind. Those closest, I'm going to read it out loud, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. This comes from a quote from Glenn Martin, who's the president of Just Leadership USA. Not about me, without me. This is a quote of a report from the North Carolina Early Childhood Foundation report titled, Not About Me, Without Me. So anyway, I want you to just hold those quotes for me as I'm speaking. Keep them in your mind. I think the most important thing I want to share with you about the study is that I think this study and Phil's team, and Joan as our fearless leader with Phil, have done more to elevate the voices of caregivers, parents and families, childcare providers, to ensure that their experiences inform and guide early childhood policy. They have done that by gathering the data from caregivers, parents, families, experiences, and centering their information and real life experiences collected in real life time as they're going through the pandemic. The information is collected. The data from all of those closest to the problem, who are also closest to the solution, have provided information that has been centered and elevated in this study that are driving, as we speak today, and informing policy. In my own experience as an early childhood person, it's taken some time, but I've come to believe that any successful and impactful policy effort in early childhood systems requires sustained and authentic engagement with the people most impacted by the racial, economic, or structural inequities. No movement, from my perspective, of social change and policy can succeed without the participation of those most affected by the inequities and injustices. I want you to hold that thought. To me, that is the major contribution of this study. It's a major contribution now, and it has promise for tomorrow. This data collection method needs to be examined and held on to, because I think it has a future in our work going forward. It's not just about the pandemic we're going to do this. There are lessons learned for all of us as a method of ensuring that the voices of those most impacted by the problems to the issues we're talking about and providing solutions have an ongoing, sustained involvement in creating solutions. Now, with that said, about the contributions, at least a reflection on the contribution of this study, I want to switch my focus a little bit and talk about what is the contribution to providers and practitioners on the ground. Next slide, please. Oh, hold it, not that slide, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Just hold it right here. Okay, so let's talk about the people on the ground that have informed, that are the solid base and continue to be the solid base of this study. What are they saying about this? The first thing I want to say to you or share with you is that the data is directly from parents and gives validity to practitioners on the ground. It helps the practitioner, whether you're a caregiver, a home visitor, a daycare provider, or even families. It helps validate what providers are experiencing, their own experience. They're out there on the front lines. They're seeing families, they're experiencing. This study validates both what the families are experiencing, and it validates the frontline providers. The other thing providers and practitioners are telling me, that the information that is collected and used to inform policy also is information that they can use to inform their practices. The information is collected, distributed, and those on the front line can give name what they're seeing. Sometimes it can be so overwhelming. You think you know as a practitioner, whether it's a childcare provider or others on the front line, you can't exactly put your finger on it, but you know something is going on, something that you've never experienced before, like this pandemic. I can tell you that I've heard from countless folks on the front lines that this study directly from families and for providers and sharing their experience has been the heart of their information in many places. The data has validated them, and not only because the data comes directly from those experiencing it, it has more validity and more information that providers and practitioners can use. The data helps them to name and validate their experiences with families. The research is written in such a way that it can be easily translated by practitioners so that the information can be used to inform what they're doing in real time on the ground. The data resonates with practitioners, has helped practices validate what they've observed with families, and help them clarify and give meaning and name what they're experiencing, and help them to go deeper and more emphasis on specific challenges that are emerging on the front lines with families. The other important contribution this study is making is that the data has helped guide virtual and direct service interventions. It has helped the staff see more specifically what the family distress is, what the child's stress is, and then focus their interventions on those things. They've helped them better understand the financial distresses, and not that the practitioners and the childcare folks didn't see it, but it helps to focus their response and helps to strongly identify in a specific way what needs to be done as a result as these things appear in their work with families and family childcare providers and other childcare providers. The data also has highlighted the need for professional development among early childhood folk. We need more development and increase our experience, professional development, and understanding the impact of stress and child and mental health. We're in there looking at education, but really this has alerted us as leaders that we've got to provide not only and be aware of not only the mental health, both child and adult mental health issues, we've got to increase our knowledge through professional development. And most important, what the data has shown us is that we have to build more and stronger collaborations with child and family mental health specialists in the field. Those are just a few things from my reflections and experience that I think the RAPID study has done from a practitioner, childcare provider perspective. Now, next slide. So now, here's my provocation. I call this provocation transformative change. Let's see, what does transform mean? Stay with me now. To make a thorough and dramatic change in a form or the appearance and character of something. Hang with me now. And the something I'm talking about here is the early childhood systems and structures. Are you with me? And I want to share with you two things to think about, which may be provocative statements, we shall see. One says, centering and elevating the voices of families, caregivers, childcare providers to ensure that their lived experience continue, not just during the pandemic, to inform and drive policy. My colleague Joan ended her presentation with that. So I'm reinforcing that provocation, and I'm putting it out there because we haven't always done it. And we'll be tempted once the pandemic is over to move on to the way things were. I don't want things to go back to the way they were because there are some issues around equity, racial equity, and other injustice that have been embedded within our early childhood system that we need to fix. The second provocation for transformative change is that we have to support and create together systematic and sustained inclusion and participation and leadership of families, caregivers, providers, and communities in planning, development, decision-making, and evaluation of policy and early childhood systems. That's transformative change. And we've got to figure out with our families, with our childcare providers, with the communities, how are we going to sustain that over time, not just during the pandemic now, sustain it and embed it into our system so it's just the way we are. To me, that would be one of the critical issues to transformative change. The other thing we've got to do is be ready to share power. There's a power equation in our work. We've got to be able to recognize and lift up and value the experiences, the lived experiences of those closest to the problem. And finally, we've got to build and transform our system to an equitable system And that's the challenge of the work ahead. And I think that the rapid study and the methodology that they've been using to gather this information is a critical part of that transformative change. So that's my provocation for our discussion today.
I am taking a deep breath and soaking that in, that provocation, Portia. Thank you so much for those comments. And I think that's a great place to start for the portion, this final portion of our webinar today is inviting examples. What does it look like on the ground when families and communities are driving policy change? I can think of a couple incredible examples from here in Oregon. I really saw firsthand the Latino community rise up and advocate for healthcare coverage for all Oregonians, regardless of immigration status, in light of the health disparities and the ways in which COVID was disproportionately impacting Latino Oregonians. And just was so inspired by that advocacy and the legislative push and the victory, the subsequent victory of the passage of that legislation. I also have colleagues at Children's Institute who have worked really closely with family childcare providers. Family care providers were saying, we need greater rental protections for when we're renting and we're operating our business out of our homes. We need some protections. And so those family care providers came together to craft a piece of policy and really advocate, build awareness of this issue. So I know there are many other examples out there, and I would like to now invite panelists to share any examples that you've seen and you're inspired by. And also for attendees, please share in the chat examples, because I think we need more of this sharing power and working in partnership with parents and community members to drive the policy and systems change that's needed.
You know, I think that Portia's remarks were so right on, particularly about the power shift. And I think when I look at communities, I did a series of podcasts last year called The New Neighborhood, where I listened to people in communities, many of whom were parents. And what they were telling me is that it wasn't just performative, their voice. It was actually making decisions. And people were listening to them in a more ongoing way. It was not come to a parent meeting one night. There's a difference in what's going on. And there was more of a formalized community-wide mechanism for that sharing and ongoing input. So, you know, I'm a big believer that this happens at the neighborhood and the community level and across programs. You have to do it in your program, but across programs, and that the power shift and the focus on equity is central to it.
I know we're going to go to the audience for questions, but I just want to second that about the power shift. We've got to let it go. The power that we have had as professionals, we've got to move away from the table, and the parents will not be at the children's table anymore. They're going to be at our table, and we've got to really embrace that. The other thing is, we've got to provide a scaffolding of support for parents to lead and make decisions. Right. And I'm not sure we know how to do that yet. Not many of us know how to do that. And that's the challenge ahead for transformation. I want to transform system. And I think this pandemic and the study and how we're doing it is going to move forward the transformation of the system in ways that maybe some of the other efforts we've had through my lifetime working did not stick. See, they weren't sustained. We went back to our own ways, like rubber band. Okay, it's over with. Crisis over with. Back to business as usual. And quite frankly, I don't want to go back to business as usual.
We have to be realistic also that all parents won't agree. And I think
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
We're seeing,
we got to be prepared for them to disagree.
And how do we, to speak to your scaffolding point, Portia, how do we help that? How do we help bridge the terrible divide that's in the country right now?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a pretty picture, and we have to acknowledge that and be intentional in our efforts to find common ground, and it's not easy.
Yes, yes. I was going to, well, not now. I have an idea, but I think we should let the audience talk now.
Agreed.
We are closely monitoring the Q&A and the chat. If folks have examples that they want to share that they're excited about and inspired by, or further questions for our panel, we would love to hear them for the 15 remaining minutes we have.
While we're waiting for those to surface, I'll give an example of a really powerful kind of initiative that fits some of these characteristics. It's called Together Growing Strong. It's in the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn, which is an extremely diverse community that has a high proportion of Chinese immigrant families and Latin immigrant families. And the initiative was started to really try to focus on and center early learning in the community. But it really started, and from my perspective, I've been a consultant to it, to the group. It started much more as a conventional project. Like we know what we're going to do, and we'll go in and do focus groups and ask people if they approve of our ideas, whether those are practitioners or family members or providers. It really started that way. So it was like community engagement, perhaps, but not really, much more than that. And over time, I've seen the principal people involved increasingly cede their power and their control in ways that are really transformative. So it went from community engagement to community empowerment, but I've encouraged them, and I think they've really supported this, to move beyond that to community self-determination, with the idea that the energy and the kind of focus and the way this will be shaped isn't going to come from the researchers involved, that the researchers have resources and tools that they can bring to the table, but it's got to be crafted by the community. And as I've seen that transformation happen, I've seen the community become engaged, and people would show up for one focus group meeting and they'd never come back again, because again, they felt marginalized and they didn't feel respected. And as things have transformed, it's really changing the way that the whole project is proceeding. And those who really had the power and the resources at the outset have stepped back away from the table, as Portia has said. And they're there, but they're there listening. And they're there trying to figure out what they can contribute, as opposed to trying to drive. And having seen that, I think, among other things, it's a good model, but it also is an indication to me that things that don't always start off on the right track can get on the right track if people are willing to be open to these issues and to the core kind of centering around issues of racial and economic equity that exist. If you just continue to ignore them, then you'll stay off track. But things can get on track, even if they've gotten off to a shaky start.
I'm seeing a couple examples shared in the chat as well. Please keep those coming in. I'm also seeing a comment about what we really need is public will and policy change. And so I'm curious to hear from our incredible panelists, what we've learned about communicating and amplifying these family voices and family and childcare provider experiences. What is resonating? What isn't? What can we do to just continue to share this really rich data and family voice so that it drives toward the kind of transformational impact we hope to see? Phil, do you want to start with just observations on how you've seen rapid EC findings be shared and used to build public will?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the extent to which what we're reporting and reflecting back are genuine voices means that the information has a kind of a compelling quality, that it hasn't necessarily been just filtered through statistical analyses. And we've seen that in terms of the interest from our own community in Eugene, Oregon, where we've had the county commissioners request presentations, the state level and national level kinds of inputs. One particular story that I think, Elena, because you're a fellow Oregonian, you'll resonate to, is that the governor of Oregon, Governor Brown, came to have us brief her on the findings, with particular emphasis on what we've been finding in Oregon. The briefing included both families and providers who were there to share their voices as well. And at the conclusion, Governor Brown's chief of staff approached us and said that the data that we've been putting out there around the material hardship and difficulty paying for basic needs of providers had strongly influenced Governor Brown around how recovery money could be spent by providers, to not just include things like cleaning materials, but also to make it possible to pay for basic needs. And so I think it's an example of how data that's collected, that's rigorous and that's objective, can still, when it has that kind of quality of really being true to the voices of the participants, really sway policymakers in terms of how they're thinking about what the needs are, and can lead to, in some cases, I think, rapid changes in the way that decisions are made about ways to support families and providers.
It's the democratization of data, in so many ways, and persistence. I mean, what have I learned in 50 years in the field? I've learned you get back up and you keep going. And I think that's a message for parents, and sending people. Someone asked me once, what's the most important thing you learned? And it's to help people see they can make change. And that's really hard right now, because we're not feeling very empowered, even in our daily lives. And I guess I would end with a plea for civility of dialogue, because I'm worried that the discourse at the ground level, even among parents, is not one that's going to be productively leading to change unless we, reach out across the divide and try to bring people together. That's our challenge now, I think.
Any final comments, closing comments from our panelists? Any final pieces of wisdom to share about how we take the next right step towards this big transformative change we've been talking about, and really creating greater stability and greater predictability and greater support and upholding of families in our communities? It's all been said. It's all been said. I think there are some great resources that are coming your way, things that people have been sharing in the chat. Thank you so much for your engagement. We'll be circling back. And a huge thank you to Dr. Fisher, Dr. Lombardi, and Portia Kennel for their insights today. And thank you to all of these attendees for your contributions. Becky?
Well, thank you, Elena, for moderating our discussion today, and to everyone who was on with us today. I don't have the final statistics, but I know we had well over 350 people who were on with us live today. So thank you all for showing up today for this very, very important topic. Our poll is still up, so it helps us to know if we're providing content that's meeting your needs, informative to you, and helping you in your day-to-day work. So please take a moment to fill out that poll if you can. and it will close momentarily. And then we'll resume with a couple of slides of things that I want to remind you about upcoming webinars. So I'll echo Elena's remarks to thank our panelists. It's been a delight getting to work with you all. And one of the things that I appreciate being staff to the webinars is I get to learn something exciting and new on every single webinar that I provide support to. And this one was in particular something near and dear to my heart. I'm a nurse midwife by training. And so this work on birth to 5 is so extraordinarily important. So thank you all for being here. As Sierra said at the beginning, we have some really important webinars coming up. We hope that you sign up for them. And it's easy to do when you register. You have the option of registering for multiple webinars at one time. So stay tuned, and our newsletters come out and provide you with more information about those. You will be getting information on this particular webinar along with all the resources. I grabbed things that people were also posting in the chat today, so we'll add those to the resources that came out. So thanks again, Elena, Portia, Joan, and Phil for being here with us today. And to everyone else, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you for being with us.